Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I'm going to share with you a recording from a recent AOP Live webinar from early in December with Greg Anderson and David Clevenger from W&S Denali. So historically, procurement has not really been elevated internally because we've focused on savings rather than revenue and growth, which is the true heartbeat of any competitive enterprise. Rather than repackaging savings in an effort to resemble that top-line impact, we need to fight for some new performance metrics. So, titled Resolving to Escape the Restraint of Savings in 2022, the webinar explores ways that procurement can connect our efforts back to business outcomes and in the process reposition our role within the enterprise. We discussed broadly three areas within the webinar. One is how stereotypical vision statements are limiting procurement's potential, mitigating their impact. We talk about some examples of the types of growth and value-oriented projects that procurement can contribute to, but also to lead. And we shared some stories of procurement teams that have broken the bonds of savings and are contributing to broader organizational goals. So with all that being said, let's jump straight into the webinar as we begin the conversation. And so I'm going to kick things off and I'm going to ask Greg, first of all, as we reflect on the year that is coming to a close here, we're recording this at the end of 2021 in December. From your perspective, what, if anything, has actually changed about procurement this year?
I think I'd start with a statement, and I put this in a post the other day on LinkedIn. There is no better time to be a talented procurement professional than now. And I'll tell you why, Phil. I think obviously there's a huge talent crunch. Everybody on this call probably is aware of that and feeling it in some way or another. But even more than that, I think there's a movement in procurement that's been accelerated. And whether it's been accelerated by COVID, by digital, whatever it is, we see procurement becoming a much more strategic function within the business. And people are making great strides to do that. So I think despite all the challenges that are happening now, supply chain wise, talent wise, just business disruption in general, I think it's a great time to be in procurement. And I think a lot of people are realizing that because procurement is starting to take a much more strategic role within the business. So I think that's the biggest trend I've seen, is that procurement's importance is on the rise.
And David, from your perspective, what are you seeing this year for procurement?
I think it's similar. A lot of attention being paid to transformation, to prepare, I think, for a broader role that Greg referenced, particularly digital transformation. But I think certainly some of the more advanced organizations with whom we work are paying attention more broadly than just solely the digital piece. They're really looking at this as an opportunity to really transform their entire operation from a process standpoint and thinking about it in terms of impact. So I think the timing for a discussion like this is probably never been better.
Yeah, that's for sure. We talk a lot about impact and outcomes, as opposed to the nuts and the bolts, perhaps, that we think of internally within procurement of how to get procurement done. It's what impact are we going to have and what outcomes we're going to help our business drive. Greg, you talked about there being no better time to be in procurement and be a talented procurement professional right now, and that move to becoming more strategic. Like, from your perspective, you obviously see a lot of organizations that are on that journey from whether it's tactical to strategic, where they're building a procurement function for the first time. What are some of the kind of pillars that you see as being really important for an organization that does kind of start to become more strategic for their companies?
Right. When we talk to procurement pros, Phil, we talk a lot about the procurement ecosystem, right? And that's a fancy term. But if you think about it, it's not just one thing. You're not going to fix everything just by saying, okay, we're going to go digital, we're going to put in this source to pay platform, and all our challenges are going to be overcome, right? we encourage our clients and we work with our clients to say, what do you need to do to really improve the overall procurement delivery ability and capabilities, procurement to support more important business outcomes, right? So how do you align the vision of procurement and the goals and objectives of procurement with the key business outcomes that your company is trying to achieve, right? So within there, you have to look at the ecosystem and say, okay, do we have the right talent to go have more strategic conversations with the business stakeholders who we want to talk to and help with smart supply strategies that help them achieve what they're trying to achieve? Do we have the capacity for that talent to break free from some of the constraints that hold back from going and having those very conversations, right? Are we set up with the right operating model that enables them to have capacity for more strategic work, right? Are we doing that the right way? Do we have the right digital enablers? Super important, right? Digital can help to automate a lot of things that are no value add or very low value add, right? So you want to use digital in the right way, but people shouldn't look at digital just as the panacea. It's going to make everything get better. I think the other thing is, as businesses become more and more dependent upon suppliers for innovation, right? Bringing innovation in from outside, right? Look at the automotive industry going to self-driving cars now and all of that technology. That really wasn't inherent in their industry. So they've had to go outside the industry to companies that provide navigation systems and vision systems and robotic steering and all of that. So you have to go and be a channel and a conduit in procurement to that outside innovation that you can bring into the company to help the company achieve the outcomes. And I think the last thing that's really important and probably most overlooked when we talk to clients is, what is the user experience like to work with procurement at your company? What are you doing to make procurement easy to access, easy to work with, and a better experience overall? And when you do that, some magic starts to happen, right? You start to deliver value for people. It's an easier way for them to work with you, and things begin to change and transform, and suddenly you become more strategic. So I don't think there's any one thing you can change. I think you have to look at your whole way you're doing procurement today and say, is this going to be the right way we should be set up for doing it in the future?
I want to just add on that user experience, David, as well, because I think, the cross section of folks who are listening today, there'll be leaders who are thinking from an organization level, but there'll also be folks who are running their own category, for example, who are thinking from their internal stakeholders and how they're managing their internal stakeholders. And David, I wonder if you have any tips on how to think about the customer experience, the user experience, and build kind of it's like an experiential procurement as opposed to this is our process and this is where you fit.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Phil, because I think at the core of it, it's kind of the same, whether it's someone running an organization talking to senior leadership within their company, or you're talking to an individual stakeholder, spend owner, functional owner within your business. It's 100% about this alignment. And I think that whereas Greg said, we need talent, we need people who are going to be able to do these things, we need to make that ask first. And we need to describe for our stakeholders and for our leaders what that experience is going to look like. And to strike that alignment, I think it really begins with sharing a language, with them. We have to choose our words carefully. We've always spoken in our own terms around savings and spend under management and the things that we felt were relevant to us. And our metrics should reflect our stakeholders' metrics. Right. I actually just coincidentally was at a dinner the other night with a very senior a woman who's been an HR executive with a number of different Fortune 500 companies. And she was talking about the shortfalls of procurement in terms of I'm trying to solve for a global talent strategy and deploy people around the globe and allow them to have an impact and be competitive. And procurement's talking to me about something costing less. And I need it to be faster, and I need it to be better, and I need to get innovation from the suppliers with whom I'm working. And that's not the solution that they're bringing to me. So the fact that we have different metrics that we're measuring by, then our stakeholders in our same business, I think, is at the core of the problem. And I think as we're trying to create that alignment, we have to be having that discussion about really deeply understanding their measurements, their needs, and not just what the business as a whole is trying to do. That's critical, obviously. But to your point about category owners, what every one of our stakeholders is trying to do and how they're measured.
Yeah, and how what they do connects with ultimately the business strategy.
Yeah, if I can add on that, Phil, a little bit, right? With a story, right? So I worked with a company once, this was years ago, and first thing we realized when we got there was, wow, procurement's just really out of touch with the rest of the business, almost persona non grata status. And we dug into it and asked the executives why, because we as consultants had access to more of the stakeholders and say, well, what's so hard about working with them? Or, oh, they claim these savings and they're not doing anything to help me grow my business. And they're taking credit for 5 years of savings, right? And we know it comes out of the P&L the next year, right? And they're going around measuring themselves against other peers and saying, look at our performance is best in class or above average on, metrics that matter to procurement, but the business doesn't care about those metrics. Right? That's what's happened with a lot of this inward focus on making procurement really good and competitive, and that's good. You should have a good operation. You got to make sure what you're doing is going to matter to the rest of the business, or you really run the risk of being rendered not relevant to them, right? Certainly strategic and maybe not even relevant. So I think it's really, really important to make sure that procurement's objectives and the way procurement is measured is supportive and aligned super well with. I think we're going to say align 150 times in this conference, but it's really lined up well with the business, right? The rest of the business.
I hate to so clearly agree with Greg, but the other word that we'll probably repeat throughout this is relevance. Is that I think one of the major factors is that those objectives that we talked about, or the traditional goals around procurement that we've discussed, are not necessarily relevant to the business, and sometimes they're incongruous, and that's really dangerous because when you lack relevance to that degree, you become really useless within the business and really difficult to work with, and that's when people start to avoid it. So even if you add in the digital enablers and you become more efficient and you become more effective, it's effective at what? Is it truly effective at something that's completely relevant to the business, or just to some of the traditional objectives that you've had within procurement?
Yeah, isn't it interesting that, for example, savings for a lot of organizations, it's a measure of procure, so that we can say, hey, look, this is our ROI, as opposed to saying, hey, this is how we've helped the business deliver on whatever their role within the organization is. So we're focusing on our story as opposed to focusing on the stakeholder's story.
Yep.
Exactly.
So, we want to talk about what we can do about that. Greg, as you're talking with procurement leaders who are currently measured on savings alone, and that's what they're expected, because that's what the business case within procurement has always been built upon. How are you helping them to start thinking about, how do we change this conversation? And even if the procurement leader may understand, if that's the right thing to do, how do we get that past the CFO, or how do we get past the COO? Somebody that's holding procurement to account and measuring procurement by that metric alone.
Right. I'd first say I think procurement's been measured by savings, and it's not bad, right? Savings are good. We want growth, and we want it to be profitable growth. But I think it's because it's one of the few things you can measure it by, right? It's tangible, and executives like to measure things and say, okay, the investments we're making in procurement are delivering these kind of savings, right? But that's where I think people are going to have to start getting comfortable with having measurements that are different and sometimes not as clear as savings are to measure. And so I think the first thing I would tell someone is, look, you've got to build trust and credibility will build trust with the executive team and with the stakeholders in the business, right? And how do you do that? So you sit down with them and you really understand, okay, we've got these business outcomes we're trying to drive for the company. And I know what that means for the head of marketing, or I know what that means for the CIO, right? And let's look at what their objectives are and then say, okay, how can procurement contribute to helping them achieve that particular objective, right? Through a smarter supply strategy, right? So what do you have to do to deliver on that? You've got to level up procurement, and you've got to show them, look, here's what we can do if you engage us early enough. We can bring this kind of talent, but you've got to make sure you have that talent. And an interesting observation I made through the years is when a talented team of consultants can come in and people see sort of the difference between more strategic folks that can have conversations with stakeholders, they say, wow, okay, if we had people like that who could act like that, then we could have a much better opportunity to be strategic in the business. So we've got to relook at our talent, right? And we've got to look at the kind of people we're bringing in, right? And it's a rethink of the function in a lot of ways. So but at the end of the day, you've got to have people in the procurement team that have the expertise and the wherewithal and the know-how to go get things done to help these stakeholders achieve their objectives, right? So you got to show them you can be a strategic business partner and provide that kind of expertise to help them solve their biggest challenges. Last thing I'd say is you'll change their perception by changing their experience.
Yeah.
If it's a better experience, if they say, wow, that was really useful, or that was a great experience working with that person from the procurement team because they really helped us go down the right road on this particular initiative. And I found super value in that, right? That's what you've got to do. You've got to change their perception by changing the experience. Clevenger, David, add to that one?
Yeah, I think this is what it all comes down to, right? And I guess I don't want to say that I disagree necessarily, but I think that there's probably more of an opportunity for us to move on from savings than we think. And again, I partially agree in that I don't know that we completely eliminate that as an objective or something that we're paying attention to. I think we maybe want to replace it with fiscal responsibility and being a good fiduciary for the business. But remember that it was procurement ourselves that introduced savings as a metric. This wasn't thrust upon us. When procurement was more of just a tactical buying function, this didn't exist. It wasn't until kind of the strategic sourcing revolution, that came along at 80s, 90s, that we introduced this as the way that procurement should be measured. And so I think we're perfectly within a reasonable range to note how we've evolved and plan to evolve, and that metric alone, or the spend under management metric alone, shouldn't any longer necessarily at least be the primary basis for how we're measured. And I think that there are some other ways, some other prospectively more concrete ways, not completely, but more concrete ways than not to measure the impact that procurement's having. And I think the most significant one is to recognize that procurement serves as the portal for the 3, 5, 10, 15,000 suppliers that are doing things for your business. Mm-hmm. And the paradigm to date is that procurement's been focused on the dollars going out. But I think to shift that to the knowledge coming in, Greg referenced earlier the automotive company example. It's certainly been very prevalent in the automotive industry for many, many years that the suppliers are the ones who are bringing innovation into those businesses. But I think the days of us measuring suppliers or being content that the box was dropped on the dock, that's what we have to move away from, right? That we have to move away from our expectation of the supplier community being delivery and start to look at it as innovation. And procurement is the organization uniquely positioned to drive that and put guardrails around it. And I think that in doing so, my expectation is actually where you're having some more strategic discussions with different stakeholders in the business, they're actually super receptive to this concept because they've never been eager to go bid out their favorite suppliers or their more strategic suppliers or hammer them down on price. They're looking to achieve a fully optimized relationship with that supplier. And sure, that's inclusive of cost, and we don't want to ignore that, but it goes so far beyond that. And to be able to define, and we see some leading organizations taking this approach with their strategic supply community, where they're defining and managing those areas of impact and that supplier's ability to drive value and the knowledge coming into the organization that they are in fact able to measure the improvements that they're seeing in those programs. Is it as clean as saying, I used to pay $1 for the pen and now I pay 80 cents? No, it's different than that. But it's not that it can't be measured.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit. Sorry, Greg, did you want to add something to that?
No, I'll let you go ahead and ask the question. I think I hope we come back to the topic of measurement, right? Because I want to hover around that.
No, I want to say I definitely do want to come back to measurement and maybe some more specificity around how we can do that. Before I do that, I wanted to just jump over to Kelly to see if we've had any questions that have come in from our audience today.
We have had some questions come in. We've also had a couple of comments. Maybe to start on a very positive note, David and Greg, I'm getting a lot of positive feedback from the audience about your choice of outfit. So everyone appreciates that you've dressed up for the video component of today's session. I've also received word, David, your sweater has already sold out online. So at that point, everybody attending, yes, we know it's out of stock, back ordered till after the holidays. Yes, we're getting lots of really positive, reaffirming feedback about your choices of outfits. But on today's topic, David, let me maybe give this question to you, and then Greg, I have a second question that I think is a response to something you shared earlier. David, there's a question here about talent, right? And this need to elevate procurement talent, but there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. Do you have a sense of when it is appropriate to hire in new talent versus investing in training? And maybe what some of the factors might be around when you chose to hire in versus training the existing talent that you have?
Sure. First of all, it bears pointing out that this is probably the first time in 20 months when I haven't had a hoodie on. So I'm, believe me, no different than anybody else in the pandemic. But the talent question is a really critical one. And I think that I'll start by saying, and Greg alluded to this earlier, there's in the future and the kinds of things that we're talking about are really a lot about relationship building and relationship management and critical thinking. Those are sort of the types of individuals that we see kind of the next level procurement being. But in terms of the timing of when you're bringing these folks in, I think that, first of all, I think you have to take a very hard look at who you have. And this can be a very difficult thing for any of us in any business to really make that determination around, do the people I have, can we enable these folks to actually grow and improve and reach that level that we need them to for what we see as the next level of our procurement operation, or do we need to look outside? And that's a tough question, but it's one that you have to ask. But I don't think you need necessarily as many people to start. I think there's no reason for you to think, well, I have to have my entire organization, ideal organization, built out completely before I can go start having these discussions. Because I think the discussions that you're going to have with leadership and stakeholders are going to inform for your organization the fit for purpose profile of the type of individual you want to be successful at your company. So I think you want to get out ahead of it really defining what value creation looks like for your business, and then using that as the model to determine what kind of individuals you want to staff and want to have as part of your team.
Greg, any thoughts you wanted to add in on that talent question before I ask you a follow-up on some of your earlier comments?
I think David captured most of it. I think there's no one right talent approach, I guess, or talent profile. It's really going to depend on your company and your culture in a lot of ways, and how you're set up, and what your spend profile looks like as well. But I think you need to say, okay, what do we need in terms of people to be more strategic, right? I think everybody's looking for people with a business mind, a better business mind, right, to work with on key strategic objectives, because you need that sort of strategic thought process that people with a business mind can bring to the party, as well as the category knowledge, right, that's required, right? We're big believers in category management and having well built out category plans and playbooks to work with, because it helps to guide sort of the overall strategy from the time you start the sourcing process all the way through the point of purchase, right? You want to make sure those category strategies are run through. So you got people that can build good strategies as well. And then the soft skills, right, that everybody mentioned. So I'd say I agree with a lot of what David had to say, which is unusual. And by the way, my tuxedo's at the cleaners with the holidays coming up. So sorry, I had to rock the fleece today, everybody.
Oh, well, it's a hit with this crowd.
Oh, great.
So to your point about soft skills, then let me come back to this point you were making about how if procurement can create the right experience, the perception of us will change. And I think Meredith, who put some comments in, I think she's reading my mind, because she commented that, while that makes sense, it does sound a little bit like a trust fall. And these are not her words, but I'm going to add mine into this. That sounds really scary, because a lot of procurement organizations have had this struggle or this angst with trying to build influence and authority over time. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is if we try to relax about that and just create the right experience, then through the changed perception, the authority and influence we've wanted for so long will follow. But it does sound like it requires a little bit of a leap of faith. Can you comment on that a little bit more?
Sure. I don't think you need to drop the policy. So let's look at the perception of procurement, right? In the past, a business stakeholder perhaps might say, all right, they enable and facilitate our contracts and the transactions that we're trying to do. Or here comes the policy police or the compliance cop, right? That's going to tell me I can't do something, right? And I think you can drive compliance and you can achieve compliance and still have a better user experience. And I'll give an example of that. So let's say you are working with somebody to set up a new supplier for a particular good that you purchase on a regular basis. You help them to learn about some new suppliers. You run a sourcing project. They're very much part of the decision. They choose a good one. And then you put that item into your catalog, right? It's available for people to purchase in a self-service mode. They go in, it's easy for them to find, it's easy for them to buy it. It's compliant buying with the right supplier, saving the company money, all a good experience all the way through, right? That can be done versus, hey, procurement, I just negotiated this agreement with these people. Can you just turn this into a contract? And procurement saying, whoa, hold on, you got to have 3 bids and a buy, right? So I think there's ways to make the system work and be compliant without having to say, we're throwing everything out. We're just going to be the feel-good people that everybody wants to work with. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying there's different ways to structure the relationship in a proactive way and to be a better business partner. So they look at, like, a lot of people set up business partners from procurement, right? And that's the go-to person who would then bring in maybe category experts. Others do it with a category expert is going to go call on that person because most of what they buy falls into that person's category. You set it up right for your organization, I think, so that people want to come and they see procurement as a business partner that's going to help them achieve what they're trying to achieve. and you sort of get the compliance and everything else along with it, right? So it's just a different approach. It's having empathy. So we do a lot of work with our clients on design thinking, and the beginning of that is having empathy for the person's experience, the person that's trying to buy something, do something, achieve something, and they need procurement's help. So you start from a position of empathy and you say, okay, I can appreciate how tough that was to work with us in the past. Let's change that.
Excellent. No, and that does tie back really to a lot of what David was saying about soft skills and relationship building and all of that, right? So, Phil, I'm going to hand it back to you and go back in and start monitoring some of these comments and questions again. But thanks, guys.
Thanks, Kelly.
Sure.
Thanks, Kelly. And sure, if anybody does have any questions, please continue to pop them in the question box. And I will be coming back to Kelly at least one more time before we sign off at the end of the webinar. So I wanted to come back to that idea of specificity around metrics. And when we think about, we talked about savings, as we think about how do we reposition what the value that procurement drives, oftentimes we've done a lot of work on driving growth in procurement. So this is a question from Amit, who talks about that one of the things when we have tried to change the positioning of savings, we've really done it and just repackaged. Well, we got these savings, but instead of it being, hitting the margins, you can go and reinvest that savings in R&D, or you can go and do something else with it. But it's kind of a repackaging of savings as opposed to coming up with different value levers altogether. So I wonder if, and I will leave it open to one of you to jump in, because I'm not sure quite who to direct this question to in the first instance. Greg, you're going to read this one? All right, you got some breathing room.
He'll start.
May I begin? David needs more time to think about the answers than I do.
So I'll put the audience on notice to test you on that one later.
No, but the repackaging of savings is something that I've heard a couple different ways, right? Sure, you create more capacity, use that budget for other things, right? So that's a good thing, right? And that's a decision made company to company. Like, what are we going to do with the savings? Are we going to let them drop through the bottom line, cut the budget, or we can just allow that budget owner to have more dollars to get more value out of, right? Either way, you're delivering value, I think. But the other way, people say, oh, look how much, to drop these savings to the bottom line, you'd have to generate this much revenue to generate that much bottom line impact. I've never talked to a CEO who said, I'm going to save our way to prosperity. Right. CEOs want the revenue. They want the growth, right? Growth gives you scale. Growth gives you ability to do a lot of things with the business you don't have. When growth is going away, the company's going to wither and fade away. So they'd rather have growth. So I wouldn't recommend saying this savings is equivalent to this much revenue. While it's true mathematically, I don't think you're not going to win any big supporters with that. So
sorry, Greg. I just want to jump in. I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but that's one of my biggest pet peeves when we talk about savings. I think there was an Aberdeen Group report from 15 years ago or something that said, oh, every dollar that you save equals $7 of revenue. And the amount of times that I saw that being the value proposition for procurement, and it kind of drives me crazy because exactly what you say, you don't cut your way to growth. And it's just really short-sighted for us to use that as a metric, I think. But sorry, Greg, I didn't want to interrupt your flow, but that's something I've been passionate about for a long time, is not using data like that.
Yeah, no, I get it. I agree. And yeah, it's a function of the operating margin of the company, right? You can just do the math. It's pretty simple. But, coming back to sort of the heart of the question, right? I think it's important to land on what are the right performance measurements for procurement based on the business outcomes you're trying to achieve. And I said this before, I'm going to say it again because it's really important. People need to get comfortable with the fact that it's not going to be as clean cut a measurement, okay? So I'm going to real world example again here. You all probably read the same thing I read in Wall Street Journal about a week or two ago. Ford and GM are now working with semiconductor manufacturers to say, look, we want to build our own chips, right? We want to partner with you, and we want to deal with this chip shortage, by vertically integrating that part of our supply chain. Super important initiative, right? The automakers are losing money, not just because people can't buy a car because there's not enough chips, but because people can't buy cars with heated seats or with, I don't know, the driverless cruise control, because those modules, they don't have chips for them, so they have to drop those options from the car. So you're losing great high margin upsell opportunity, right? So it's a big problem, big strategic problem for the automakers. And so now they're going to go out and forge relationships with people like Global Foundries or Qualcomm or any of these semiconductor companies. And procurement's going to be right in the middle of that, right? And you say, okay, now how do you measure procurement's performance on an important initiative like that, right? And I think you can look at some creative metrics for that type of a situation to say, how much capacity have we secured by a certain period of time? How much have we improved our sales and the ability to sell these options because we now have security of supply, right? How effective were we at cutting over from our existing third party, right, selling us a module with that chip in it to our own chip production, right? And being able to make that transition on your supply chain design effectively, right? And those are very unique to that particular project, but I think that's the kind of metrics you need to look for, not some general it's savings or nothing, right? So it's for each one of these big initiatives, say, hey, measure procurement's performance on that, right? Let's just talk about what's important so that procurement's metrics are aligned with those of the business. The other thing I'd say about this particular example too is Ford and GM are going to start hiring chip designers, which they really never hired before, right? I wonder what they're going to do in procurement, right? As far as having chip expertise in procurement now, are they thinking all the way through, right? So that's something I think is a real world example. So when you look at measurements, I think if the role of procurement is changing, then the way their performance is assessed has to change as well. And that's a tough decision, but I think if you're a procurement leader and you go in and you talk, it makes sense to an executive, right? It makes sense. Say, look, we want to drive this alignment with the business outcomes the business is trying to achieve. So let's make sure our measurements, our performance, the way we're measured in our performance is in alignment with that.
So David, kind of building on what Greg said then around different measures, and when we go back to that very first question I asked, which was around like how's procurement changing and how's procurement changed over the last year, are there things that you're seeing, perhaps across your client base or just folks that you're talking to within the procurement community, where procurement has been asked to deliver different outcomes, different impact than we have in the past, or that there's different elements that are coming to the fore now that we weren't necessarily thinking about? So those can be drivers of different kind of value measures, if you will, because we're being asked to deliver different things.
I'd say that the interesting component of this is that, unfortunately, procurement isn't being asked to do different things. I think in the instances where procurement isn't adding the kind of value that the organization wants, the organization doesn't say it, they just sort of go silent. And then you just don't have the relationship with those stakeholders. I do think, though, we certainly see examples of where procurement organizations are proactively changing what they do, and they're adopting a model not dissimilar from the one Greg outlined. And Greg, thank you for filibustering just long enough for me to come up with something to say. 21 years working with this guy, Phil. I don't know what I'm thinking. But one of the really key areas is as you're going in and now looking at each one of these stakeholder relationships and really understanding what it is that's critical to them. I think the one area where I would actually take a little bit of exception, and this also ties to the talent question that was asked earlier, is this expertise component. So in order for procurement to be relevant, do we have to have experts in every category that we touch? No, I genuinely don't think that you do. I think that the expertise and where we see success is, so for example, companies who are now working with stakeholders, I used the HR example earlier, around what are some of their key spends. And now you look at that, and instead of saying, okay, we paid X, we want to get this to Y, we say, what are the value drivers in this category? Mm-hmm. What are the key areas of value that we can derive from this relationship? And how do those, in some cases, relate to cost, but also relate to the value that our employees are getting? So an example that we've used for years, so pharmacy benefits management. We have clients that instead of just negotiating this deal, are working with the provider in a very consultative way to say, well, what drives your cost? And subsequently, what drives value for our organization? Well, generic utilization does, and network access does, and specialty trend management does. And these are all the things that kind of matter. And instead of again, having a traditional kind of a bid, let's work with the experts who, by the way, are our HR people and the suppliers, and create that methodology to say, okay, now we're going to take, instead of a backwards look and getting together once a quarter and finding out how much Lipitor we bought, let's take a forward look at this relationship, and let's understand, for example, what's best in class for generic utilization, and where are we? And what are the people who are at the top of that chart? What are they doing? How did they get there? And what are the recommendations that the provider has? Someone has to identify and manage and mobilize that entire process to make sure that that happens. And that can be the role of procurement, so that you can see on an ongoing basis for each one of these factors that you're moving toward a fully optimized solution with that supplier. And again, not just a box on the dock anymore. And that there is real measurable value that comes with that approach. And the companies that are doing that are not only having success in driving value for their organization, they've totally changed the experience of the stakeholder in the business. Now you're giving HR something that they find enormously valuable, a deeper, more successful, more productive relationship with a key supplier that they have. And now we're getting the innovations from that supplier. We're having the relationship, so we're reducing the risk with that supplier. And it becomes something that there are measurable components to, but you've totally changed the experience and the impression of procurement that stakeholder has. Now this is not about somebody who's coming in trying to own your spend or have authority over your spend or drive their own agenda. Somebody who's completely aligned with you. It's been like 2 minutes since we said aligned. I'll bring it back. And somebody that's really helping you to forward your objectives.
Greg, anything you wanted to? I have a couple of follow-ups, but I don't want to give David entirely the floor. So anything that you wanted to add to what he said there?
No, let's look at the follow-ups. Let's. I don't know that to that particular example. That's spot on.
So my follow-ups then. So one thing is kind of restating. So we're looking at metrics from a stakeholder by stakeholder or category by category perspective, as opposed to this is a blanket metric that we should be pushing out on everything that we do in procurement. So we can offer a very localized, like specialized experience as it goes back to that customer experience, because we're going to figure out the metrics for that person or for that project or for that function, whether it's HR or whoever else you're working with. So my follow-up question to that then is, how do you then consolidate all these very disparate metrics from, you've got certain metrics for the pharmacy benefits category, you've got different metrics from a SaaS category, you've got different metrics from an MRO category, whatever it may be. How do you consolidate all these, or can you consolidate all these into a story that, paints a picture for the CEO or for the CFO that still allows them to look at that and say, yeah, procurement's delivering a ton of value here that, is beyond question?
I'll start that very quickly here and then turn it over to Mr. Anderson. I would say that the consistency there, Phil, is the methodology, is that you're applying the same approach everywhere. That yes, there are some unique aspects to the chip manufacturers, versus the pharmacy benefit providers versus the IT consultants and any other spend. But the role that procurement should be playing and the methodology that they should be employing, and thus the skills that they should be able to exhibit, are really consistent across all of these areas. To the point Greg made earlier, there may still be areas where you feel that it's a necessary component to have some category expertise built in to that organization, and that would be a unique factor. But I don't think it's necessarily as disparate as we're making it, that if we can apply the methodology in a uniform way, that the skill set remains pretty consistent, and the output, the impact, should be able to be communicated in a pretty specific way. What the value drivers are by category, those are going to vary without question, but I think that's okay.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think, again, it becomes a bit more, of a complete picture look, I think, at how you measure the effectiveness and performance of procurement, from function to function. But if you look at, are we achieving the business outcomes? And when we see why we're doing that, right? We did get the growth. We did get the expansion into Europe we were looking for. We did launch a new product on time because procurement helped us get the cost of the components right in the bill of material, and therefore we were able to take it to launch because we were hitting the target gross margin on it, right? All those things, you can say, okay, how did they do in each individual initiative? But I would walk around the organization and talk to my leaders if I was the CEO and say, hey, what's it been like this last year working with procurement? Are they helping you achieve what you're trying to achieve? Are they helping to propel the business forward? Are they more strategic to you than they were in the past? And get that kind of feedback as well. Because at the end of the day, if it's all working, if the system's working, the objectives will be achieved, right? And if procurement's playing their part in that, or even playing an outsized part in it, then they should get their fair share of the credit for that as well. So I think again, everybody wants to measure things so precisely, and I think you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable maybe with not being able to precisely measure everything, but saying, no, they really helped us solve this particular challenge, and as a result, we got the product out on time, or we've been able to move to the cloud with all our applications 6 months earlier than we expected. So we're gonna see the benefits of that. Those are the kind of things where it isn't all just black and white measurement.
That comfort with the unknown, or being uncomfortable, I think is really important. I've often said that you can have an organization that's beat all of their savings goals, and yet within the organization they're not seen in a positive light, and that leads to transformation. Right. You can have another organization that perhaps had a savings goal, didn't necessarily reach that savings goal, but actually had all the executive team talking the virtues of working with them and how procurement's enabled them to build on and deliver their business strategy. And it's all about the conversation in the car between the CFO and the CEO on what they're hearing about procurement. That's really where we're measured. It's not necessarily in numbers that we can present to make ourselves feel good about the impact we're having. It's almost like those numbers again are like internal, pat ourselves on the back, and didn't we do a good job, versus what are people really talking about the impact that we had for them as being more important. And like you said, that's really hard because we're not in control of that necessarily, other than delivering an experience, especially if the numbers aren't necessarily where we want the numbers to be.
But Phil, you just hit me with an analogy here, right? A lot of companies now are really measuring the customer experience, right? And they're getting all data socially and whatever, and checking feeds and making sure that the customers are satisfied, right? Same thing, right? It's the same thing. These are, I don't like to use the term internal customers, but they're your internal business partners. And are they satisfied with the performance of procurement and what they're delivering to them in terms of value and support to achieve the outcomes, right? I think that's how you have to start to look at it. What is the customer satisfaction internally with the procurement organization?
Yeah, and I think the big idea there on the heels of that thinking is that part of the evolution potentially is that you're two organizations now, and that there's buying, right? There's procurement ops that is just that function of that PO traveling through the system, somebody making a request and getting a product and getting it paid. But then there's this entirely different thing, this relationship piece, this engagement piece, and maybe that splits off. Maybe we just finally just sort of cut these things, and you bifurcate that, and you really take this thing away from the other, because the association with it certainly isn't benefiting you in any way. And so, you define this evolved function, and you separate it completely from that. And that's where you probably have an opportunity at that point to create your new normal and your new measurements, and not have it necessarily so tied to what you've been doing in the past.
Kelly, I want to come over to you just to see if there's any other questions that we've had over the last 20 minutes or so from the audience to pose to David or to Greg.
Yes, as a matter of fact. And David, staying with you, one of them is a follow-up on a point that you made a few minutes ago. Maybe let's go back to it and see if, first of all, the folks I'm getting comments from heard it the way you meant it, and then see if you want to expand. You talked about the methodology being what creates consistency for procurement. And I had a couple of people suggest that some number of years ago, that was probably the exact same thing being said about the X-step sourcing process. And when the methodology became sort of the foundational piece of creating stability and consistency for procurement, it also became this thing that we started pedantically following like a checklist. Is that the kind of methodology that you mean, or did you have something else in mind when you were talking about methodology?
That's a great question. And first of all, it bears pointing out that for a long, long time, I think that the strategic sourcing methodology was enormously effective, and it was a complete game changer, and it helped to rationalize costs across an immeasurable number of industries and areas. So I don't want to give the impression at all that the consistency of that methodology and the utilization of that was in any way a negative thing. Here, what I think I'm referring to from a methodology standpoint is more the process of engagement with the stakeholders. I think the difference is, whereas the strategic sourcing methodology really had a singular outcome, right? It was intended to create transparency around the negotiation. Here, I think it could be, the output could be any number of things. Greg shot off a couple of examples earlier. It could be speed to market. It could be quality. It could be innovation. It could be value, dollar value. But the process of engagement with the supplier, so this methodology of how we interact, how we get to know the supplier, how we understand their objectives, how we align our objectives to theirs, and how we create an approach to their supplier community and their categories that's now aligned to the overall business objectives as well as their own departmental objectives. That methodology, I think, is where you need to be consistent. I think what's different is that the output from that in every case could vary and should vary, because not all of those have the same goal, which has been a little bit the problem to date, is that cost savings isn't the objective for every category, for every group across the business.
Greg, are there any checks and balances or internal ways that procurement should have of routinely reviewing our processes or methodologies or objectives to make sure that we're not saying, oh, that old way, that is no longer optimal, we need to replace it. And then the new way just becomes the thing that we all go into autopilot and do. Is there a way that procurement can sort of protect themselves from following back into this, okay, now this is the process that we follow blindly, instead of looking for where there need to be purposeful differences between projects or category strategies or parts of the business?
Yeah, and I think you can apply some lean thinking to that, as well as maybe just looking at value stream mapping, right? And where is procurement? What's the process look like? And at each step, does that create waste? Is that adding value? And don't just take procurement's lens on that. Take the stakeholders, take the people you're working with in the business, take their perception on that, right? To say, okay, how do we do this and continuously improve this process? We have to change the process due to a policy change or some other reason. But I think just constantly look at how you're doing things and ask why. Boy, have you ever gone somewhere and just said, why do you do it like this? And be like, well, it's how we've always done it. And you remember where the hell that came from. And it's really bad and it's wasteful, but we do it because, I don't know, we have Stockholm syndrome and we just have sympathy for our captors and we just keep doing it because that's how it's always been done. I think that's what you have to do, is ask, is this still necessary? Is this still relevant? And digital transformation is making that question come up more and more, to say, okay, do we need a human doing this? Could we automate this? David talked about separating the strategic from the tactical, that downstream stuff. That's a pretty interesting concept that I really hadn't thought about. But when you think about it, down there, somebody from a big pharma company said once, and I love the statement, if we're touching it in procurement, down in Proc Ops, we better be adding value. Otherwise, automate it, right? Just make that PR become a PO and become an invoice that we do a three-way match on, right? Just automate the heck out of it, because there's really not any value you're creating down there. So I think as we need to constantly reassess how we're doing things and ask, is this still the right approach? Is it still relevant? Does it work for this category? Should we change it? And do that. We used to have a process and methods group where David and I worked a long time ago. And I remember they drew out the process, right, that we followed, and it filled a wall of a hallway in the building. And I said, they're like, what do you think? I said, I think you should tear it down. They said, why? I said, I don't want any customer to see that and think we're adding so much complexity to a process. It doesn't have to be this complex, right? So that's what you have to do, is look at the processes. I think constantly refreshing and looking at that, saying, where can we improve? How can we change it? How do we improve the experience? How do we improve the outcomes?
All right. Thank you very much, Kelly. I'm going to... we're running very short on time, but I'm always one to take it right to the edge. But I'm going to take advantage of the competitive tension between the two of you to see who can answer this question in the shortest number of words, the fewest number of words.
I'm doomed. I'm doomed.
My last question is, I'm going to ask you, Greg, first of all. It was a question from Michael. What do you think the number one priority for procurement leaders is as we enter into 2022?
Rethink what procurement can be for their business.
All right. David?
Innovation.
There we go. One word. That did it. Both very qualified answers. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I really appreciate you joining us for this webinar. Of course, Kelly, thank you for bringing across the questions that we got through the audience through the webinar. And I'm sorry that if there's questions that we weren't able to ask today. And David and Greg, it's always a pleasure. We always have good fun, so I appreciate your time today. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside, enter in /subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.